Hey everyone, I'm Kristen, the anxiety therapist, and today is part 3 of my 3-part series on defense mechanisms. And today I want to focus on immature defense mechanisms. Harvard psychiatrist George Vaillant did a lot of research on immature defense mechanisms, and so I'm going to highlight 4 of them. The first is acting out, then fantasizing, passive aggression, and somatization. And so when you think about immature defense mechanisms, just like the name implies, think about kind of regressing back to some more childlike ways of coping with emotions. For starters, we have acting out. If you imagine your emotions as actors sort of yearning for the spotlight, sometimes we sort of shove them backstage, right? And so their voices are unheard. And so acting out is when these emotions, instead of being expressed in words, they get communicated through actions. So what does this look like in real life? This could be a person who, if they feel cornered in a really heated argument, they storm out of the room. And so this dramatic exit, it might momentarily diffuse the tension, but it really doesn't resolve the underlying conflict or convey the depth of what they're experiencing emotionally. Another example might be punching a hole through the wall instead of communicating your anger verbally. Just to throw in another example right now, I have a 3.5-year-old, and so this is just very typical for a child that age where, he's still learning to identify his feelings and what's going on inside his body and how to verbalize that. And so we really have to guide him, if he's displaying an acting out behavior, we know that that's his way of trying to communicate with us that something is wrong. So same goes for adults. If we haven't really grown up with really the self-awareness of what our emotions are trying to tell us or how to name and identify our emotions, then acting out can sort of be our form of communication. So the second one is fantasizing. This is where we sort of suspend reality and let our imagination take the lead. This could look like daydreaming. It could look like fantasizing. It's sort of this detachment from the harshness of reality. It sort of offers this solace and a rehearsal space for future aspirations. This can be helpful in the moment, but when it becomes a predominant coping strategy, it can really turn into disassociation and detach people from being present in their lives, and they're sort of more so watching their lives unfold as opposed to really experiencing it. So a real life example might be a person who sort of spends hours fantasizing about a perfect romantic relationship and meeting their soulmate and their perfect person, but they're really kind of neglecting the opportunities to forge those real meaningful connections in their real life. Another example of fantasizing might be imagining yourself as successful and popular as opposed to really putting in the work to be self-reflective and work on that personal growth. So third, we have passive aggression. This one is super, super common, right? This is sort of the silent rebellion. It's our way of expressing anger or dissatisfaction without direct confrontation. And it's sort of this resistance that is spoken with our actions instead of words, or the lack thereof. This defense mechanism really tends to come from a fear of conflict and a desire to assert control or inflict pain without actually taking responsibility. An example might be an employee who feels undervalued. They might resort to subtle forms of resistance like procrastination or intentional inefficiency. And so they're expressing their discontent behaviorally as opposed to voicing their concerns directly with their manager or boss. Another example might be avoiding direct or clear communication with someone who makes you feel anxious or insecure. This is something I work with my clients on a lot because, there's passive aggression, assertiveness, and aggression. And it's really, really hard for people to be in that middle camp, in the assertiveness camp. So a lot of people tend to be sort of overly aggressive and defensive and sort of confrontational, or they tend to be passive aggressive where they're not clearly communicating their needs or their grievances, but they're doing so behaviorally. And so finally, we have somatization. And this is essentially when our psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms. And so it's sort of, Valiant saw this as a form of communicating sort of what's going on internally to the external world. And just as a society, I think we are more accepting of physical ailments versus sort of mental or emotional ailments. So sometimes it can feel safer to express emotions physically. Again, this is subconscious. This is not something we're doing intentionally to be manipulative or anything, but it might be safer for our emotions to come out in a physical way. This might be somebody who experiences recurrent stomach aches or headaches during periods of high stress or emotional conflict. It's sort of these physical ailments that are the body's way of signaling that all is not well on the emotional front. Another example would be maybe you're going through a breakup, and so you somaticize this grief through, just feeling really run down and tired and lethargic. I know this happened to me personally when I was in grad school. I had a huge crush on one of the guys who was also attending school there. And we finally went on a date, and I remember getting ready for the date, and I was so anxious that I actually threw up. And, that was my body's way of just kind of expressing that anxiety in the moment in a physical way. And that's the only time that's ever happened to me, but it just shows like how powerful our emotions can be. This also shows up a lot in kids who have anxiety. Oftentimes, anxiety in children will manifest as stomach aches or nausea. And again, they might not have the words or the self-awareness or the ability to name emotions, and so it can manifest physically. That's just a little overview of the 4 immature defense mechanisms. And I want to be clear that this is not about labeling or judgment. It's really just about gaining insights into our behavioral patterns, the sort of invisible forces that shape them. So they're not flaws, but just think of them as these sort of signposts that are giving us information about the areas of our lives that might need attention, understanding, and ultimately some healing. And so when we're becoming aware of these defense mechanisms, we can just approach them with more curiosity and compassion for ourselves and others. And then just having that awareness can really be the first step toward developing more adaptive coping strategies. So I would love to hear about your experience with any of these. I think, they're super common, and let me know if you have any questions. I will talk to you next week. Take care.